morning, everybody. We're here for this exciting session titled Intergenerational Mobility and Assortative Mating. And we'll start first with the paper by Neil Cummins and Greg Clark, and then Jennifer Withrow's paper, and then Matthew Curtis's paper. We're ready to go. So, Greg, the floor is yours.
Okay, folks. First technical difficulty. There we go. The background here is that marital assortment is actually very important for three things. It's going to determine household level inequalities in the society. It's going to be influential in terms of intergenerational mobility. And then for the Industrial Revolution period, it has this interesting potential consequence of creating much fatter kind of upper and lower tails that may matter for economic growth. And what are the claims we're going to make here? We've got a very short time, so let me just get to the key points. What we're going to show is that marital assortment on education and abilities is much stronger than conventionally measured in England, all the way back to 1837. Also, intergenerational persistence is equivalently much higher, much more persistence, again, all the way back to 1837. Marital assortment, we can show, is actually always based on the groom and bride characteristics. And in terms of the outcomes for children, we can also demonstrate that there's a precise symmetry, that mothers and fathers are equally important in determining child outcomes. And so it does then have these consequences in terms of intergenerational mobility. Now, problem with measuring marital assortment is that before the 1920s, most married women in England, or most women getting married, don't have formal educational status. And a lot of upper class women are not even ascribed any kind of occupational status. And the census records for women are often just blank in these terms. And so what we're going to do here is measure this without direct measures of the bride's attributes. And I should emphasize at this point that the method we're implementing here was first implemented by Matt in his PhD dissertation. And so you'll see when we get to the third talk, this method come up again, but it's actually original with his dissertation. And so how are we going to measure marital assortment without information on women? So what we're going to assume is that people have measured attributes and then X, which is underlying abilities. And these two are linked by measurement errors and also just chance factors in determining people's social outcomes. And then we're going to make three assumptions. We're going to assume that women inherit as strongly as men the underlying social abilities from their fathers and their mothers. That potential grooms have the ability to observe these underlying social and educational abilities, and they value them. And that matching in marriage is only between the groom and the bride. And so we're going to have two important things we want to measure: R, which is the marital correlation in these underlying characteristics, and B, which is going to be the intergenerational correlation, again, in these underlying characteristics. And here's the situation we're going to observe in the marriage market. Fathers and father-in-laws are connected to the groom and the bride with this parameter B, which is the underlying intergenerational transmission. The groom and the bride are going to match with this parameter R. And because the matching is between the groom and the bride exclusively, that's going to imply that the groom and the father-in-law are going to have a correlation of R times B. Okay? And what we're going to exploit then is we're going to have the father-in-law stand in for the bride in terms of measuring the marital correlation. And the important thing, though, is that we don't observe in any of our data these underlying correlations. There's always going to be some measurement error because of this factor U, this imperfect link between underlying abilities and outcomes. So the observed marital correlation will be theta times R. The observed intergenerational correlation will be theta times B. And so the situation we'll observe again in the marriage market is that we're going to have these measures measured with error, But here's the crucial thing we can implement. If you take the groom to father-in-law correlation of theta RB and divide that by the father to groom correlation of theta B, you eliminate the measurement error problem and you leave yourself just with R, the marital correlation. And similarly, if you take the father to father-in-law correlation, it's going to be theta RB squared, because you have to go from father to groom to bride to father-in-law, and the measurement error only shows up once, but the other factors then show up each time multiplying. You're going to have theta R squared, divide that by theta RB, the groom to the father-in-law, and you're going to be left with B. And so the proposal here actually is to use this marital data to actually get around the measurement errors that are inherent in measuring social mobility over time, but also to measure the underlying correlation between men and women, again over time, but again independent of these various measurement errors. And we have for Britain an amazing source of available data, which is there's 106 million marriage certificates in government records from 1837 to 2021. We have access to about 1.7 million of these. And so we have an enormous set of data. Unfortunately, it's very heavy in the early 19th century and less heavy later, but we're actually in the process still of collecting. And so I'll just show you this table to see that for the earliest period, you will have about 540,000 marriages. By the time we get to 1980 to 2021, we're still collecting vigorously there, but we're just down to 9,600. But we hope to be able to double that and get much more precise estimates. And when we take this data and we just apply standard social status of occupation measures such as HISCAM and CAMSIS, what you'll see is first the correlation of the son to the father. You can see that that is declining over time. And that will be interpreted by a lot of people as implying that there must be greater social mobility in the modern era than earlier. But we're actually going to dispute that once we apply the measurement correction. And then you see the correlation of the son to the father-in-law. And you notice that that's always less than the son to the father. And that's consistent with, again, the matching between the bride and the groom. And that also is declining. And then you see the correlation of the father to the father-in-law. That's less than the correlation of the son to the father-in-law. Again, that's consistent with the type of matching that we identify. And here's the result. Basically, in England, from 1837 till now, the marital correlation in terms of estimated underlying characteristics is close to 0.8. And this is an amazing cultural phenomenon where people could choose to marry in all kinds of ways, but somehow they're matching very tightly, and it's not changing over time. And these estimates are very precise for the 19th century. They're looser later, but we will have better ones soon. And so it is an amazing phenomenon that for some reason, marital assortment is very tight. And then here's the intergenerational correlations, and these even seem to be too high somehow. And one possible thing that's driving them up is that the fathers are measured at the same time in terms of occupational status. The son is measured 30 years later. Those correlations are going down over time. And so it's possible that that is actually driving up the father correlation relative to the son, to the father-in-law. So those may be biased upwards a bit. But again, as I say, they imply very little social mobility. Now, is the matching purely groom to bride? We've got three tests. First, in the case the bride is a minor, you need the father's permission. And so that we would think would maybe lead to more groom to bride, groom to father-in-law matching. Another case, though, is often the records identify that the father is dead at the time of the marriage. And so in this case, there isn't any father-in-law really to match to. So we would think that those cases would be ones where there's poor groom to bride matching. And then the third test is the correlation of the bride to the groom's father versus the groom to the bride's father. This time, though, using another measure we have for the 19th century, which is the literacy. People sign the register. So we know when the bride and groom are literate. And it turns out we can apply the same kind of method to show what the correlations are, again, using literacy matched up to occupation. Here's what happens is if the bride is of full age, it hardly affects the estimated correlation. If the bride's father is dead, again, we see very little effect on the measured correlation. And so it's quite consistent with the idea. It really is matching of groom to bride. And as I say, the alternative method is to use literacy. Now we get a much more complicated set of error terms. And so when we match literacy to occupation, we'll get these other measures. Also, brides are less literate than grooms on average. And so it's asymmetrical in terms of the error structure between the correlation to the bride and the groom. But what you can see again, though, is we take the groom to the father-in-law divided by the father to the groom, will again spit out R. If we take the bride to the father and divide that by the bride to the father-in-law, again, the ratio of those two will be R. And so when we do that estimate, what we find is that the bride's correlation, literacy to occupation, is actually even stronger than the groom's correlation to the father-in-law. And so we would like those to be identical, those measures. They're both high. They're not identical, though. And so, but there's definitely no evidence of the asymmetry that we would expect to observe if the groom is matching to the father-in-law, because then the bride to the father should actually have a much weaker connection if that was the way the connection was occurring. What are the implications? This was the thing about the asymmetry. How important are women to child outcomes? So using another set of data, which is an extensive genealogy of about 410,000 people in England, what we do for a lot of children, thank you, is identify the grandfather, the paternal grandfather, and the maternal grandfather and their characteristics, and then see how well these predict the outcomes of the child, where they're both in a regression estimate. And as I say, if the flow is as described, we should again get symmetry in terms of the outcomes on the child between the paternal and the maternal grandfather. In the case of wealth, this is not the case. What happens is paternal grandfather's wealth is much more predictive than maternal grandfather's wealth. And that's very consistent with the fact that sons often inherited more than daughters in this, and we can see that in the records. That's quite clear. But if you look at occupational rank or attainment of higher education, those coefficients are indistinguishable, right? They are of the same magnitude and not statistically different. And so we are actually achieving nice symmetry again. So just to sum up the conclusions here, marital assortment is much stronger than conventional estimates would suggest. And so conventional estimates would have numbers like 0.3 or 0.4, 0.45 or something in case of education. Intergenerational persistence is also much higher than, again, the gross numbers would suggest. The assortment seems to be on the bride to the groom characteristics, even in a world where brides did not have explicit occupations or education. And women mattered as much as men in terms of transmitting status across generations in this world. Thank you very much. I'm finishing early.
Okay, next we have Jose Espin-Sanchez from Yale University to comment on Greg's paper. I'm dying to know what you're going to say.
Thank you. Let me get my slides here. Sorry. Five. They put first. Oh, this thing here. Okay. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay, there we go. So thank you for the presentation, Clark, and thank you for the paper. I think it's a great paper. I think we are moving now towards a better understanding of the role of women in society at large, but in particular in social mobility. And I think that this is a important step on the right direction, that we want to understand better the role of women throughout history and even today in different social aspects, right? And one of the problems that economic historian has had is usually the data, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries, because women change their last name when they marry. It's much harder to track the relatives and the maternal grandfathers to matrilineal line. So using marriage records, you can go around that because women have not changed their last name when they marry, and you can see their fathers. And why this is important, we now have evidence in developing countries and in developed countries that women have a different role in the household. In particular, it says that women have a higher taste for investment in child human capital. So in households where women have more bargaining power, children get more invested in human capital, particularly strong for girls, but also for boys. And as Claire mentioned, this is important also for intra-household bargaining, and the choices that the household will make will be affected by the relative importance of the woman, or the relative power of women. Just a little bit of self-promotion. We had this article forthcoming in the Journal of Economic History. It's about pre-modern Spain. Then we actually have a direct measure from women. We also use marriage records. And what we do find is that the coefficients that we're going to talk about are different for men and women, but over time, by the end of the 18th century, we do see that they converge together. So the symmetry that they found, they have assumed in their paper, is not inconsistent with what we found, that by 1800, seems to be most of those effects are pretty symmetric. Okay? So now those are all the things I like about the paper, and there's a lot of things to like about the paper. Now I have 3 comments that they are going to grow in orders of importance. The first one is the effect of mothers. I'm going to show you later. The first part of the paper, the math essentially assumes that the mothers have no effect on the coefficients. And at the end of the paper, they kind of had this other evidence with literacy, and they said the effect is the same. I think in some sense the evidence is not consistent with either of those, although I'm happy to assume that the effect is the same, because otherwise it's very little that you can say with the data. Okay, so I'll talk about this in a second. The second thing is something that has been bothering me for a while, and now I have a better understanding. And it's not just this paper. I think this is the state of the question. When people use, for the US, IPOMS data, or in other situations, OX-score, you are essentially assigning for everybody in the same occupation the same income. And that is essentially giving away all the variance within that occupation and assuming a strong correlation between father and son. So I'm going to show you some numbers for the US and how this will bias the results. And finally, interpretation of the results. Up to here is just all what the data say. Now you can interpret the results in different ways. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we know from science on the effect of genetics on cognition, and then how the way the genes interact, how we can measure heritability when there is an effect on genetics into the traits. Okay, so that's going to be the plan for the next few minutes. Okay. So the first thing, first comment is very simple. This is the model they have, where they have a groom father to the groom, bride's father to the bride, and there's a correlation between groom and father. Now, if mother has an effect on the child, see what they say later, this will be the picture that you have. Again, the dashed circles are women for which we don't observe their status. Now, if this is the picture, then when you try to compute the correlations between groom father and groom, it's a little bit more complicated. Now, if, again, you're willing to assume that BM, the effect of the mother, is equal to B, then you can go around this and you have a slightly different formula than the one they have. But at the end of the day, they can essentially apply all the method to apply this. Okay, so I think if you're going to assume that B is equal to BM, you can redo the math, like you do at the end of the paper, and just have a slightly different estimate. But everything should work fine. Okay. Now, this is not so much a comment or a critique to their paper, but to the state of the question, also what most people do in the situations. So maybe I'm abusing my position here as discussant just to talk about this a little bit more. So when you use occupational score, as I said, you're imposing the average or the median of that occupation from some other data set into everybody in the same occupation. That means you are not using all your data typically because you are disregarding the variance, just collapsing all the information. This, I'm going to show you in a second, is creating an upward bias in your estimates, because this is creating a non-classical measurement error. And the idea is the error that you are making on the son and the error you're making on the father are not independent. They're actually perfectly correlated. So instead of having attenuation bias, you have an upward bias, and you get a correlation of 1. Okay, and I'm going to show you a very simple way to actually get rid of this bias, just randomly assigning, randomly draw from the distribution of occupation, knowing the mean and the variance. Okay, that's my preferred estimation. And again, this is something we're working on with Chris Vickers and Joe Ferry. The data I'm going to show you, rather than show you the econometrics, I'm going to show you some data. So I think it's a much easier argument. I want to have 4 columns. So one is the regular IPONs, just median. Second one is by state. So we did the same thing with IPON, but instead of looking at the distribution of the whole country, the whole US, we look at the distribution of occupations by state, and then we assign those. We want to see that the difference is small, but maybe in their sample, in other sample, there are bigger differences across space. But both of them are going to have this feature that there are no difference across time, right? Because we're just fixing different occupations. So the first one doesn't have any difference across time or space. The second one has difference across space, but not across time. Third column, we're taking the distribution of income by occupation and just simulating, knowing the mean and the variance. And the third one, I'm going to show you the extreme case in which what the IPONs is doing is assigning perfect correlation between the father and the son. Simulated is assuming kind of zero correlation in how you're drawing from the distribution. The last one will be assuming negative correlation between those two, right? So this is probably unrealistic, but just to see that this also this will also be consistent with the assumption that the distribution is the same, but you're willing to assume the other extreme. Okay, so this is what we have. So first row, we just have the estimates. In the second table, we have same data, but you only focus on pairs of father and son with the same occupation. And in the last table, you want to focus on father and sons with different occupations. Okay, so you look at the first row, you can see how just doing IPONS data, you get a correlation of 0.45. If you look at the third column, we just drawing randomly from the distribution father and son, you get 345. Oh, so it's a large difference. And where is the difference coming from? So just look at the second table. For the set of pairs when the father and the son has the same occupation, what you get is just artificial correlation of 1, right? There's not even standard error, it's just 1. If you do what we did by state, you have a little bit less correlation than 1. That's because some people move from one state to another. So because we're doing assigning different income by state, you have a slightly different number. When you look at the third column, which is the one I like best, the correlation is 0.2. Now, if there's only one occupation in that category, then you will have a correlation of 0. But because there are different occupation across the pairs of father and son that has the same occupation, you still get this estimate. Okay, and again, you go to the right, to the extreme, you assume that it's negative correlation, you get a negative number. Okay. Now, 2 things to remark here. To be fair, probably in any data set, you want to think that the correlation when you're drawing, correlation between father and son within the same occupation, is not going to be 0. You're probably thinking father and son, they have a farm, maybe the son has the same farm. So it's not fair to say this is a random draw from any farmer, but also you don't want to assume that it's 1. So I think also when you do these numbers that you can have a better sense of what's going on. Okay. Now, when you look at the last table, you can see that all the numbers are basically the same. So when you are looking at correlation between father and son when they have different occupation, then all of those are going to give you basically the same number. So the taking the average, taking the median, taking a random draw, all are consistent estimates. So all the change is happening in the pairs of father-son that have the same occupation. Now, in this sample, only 13% of the sample has father and son with the same occupation. And only this 13% is already moving the estimate from 0.45 to 0.35. Okay. If you think about a sample in which you may have 60% of your sample being father and son with the same occupation, what does it mean? That means that when the correlation for different occupation is 0, your total estimate is going to be 0.6. When the correlation outside the different occupation is 0.5, then your total estimate is going to be 0.8. Okay, so if your sample is 60% father and son with the same occupation, then all your estimates are going to be basically between 0.6 and 0.8. So that's an important thing. The second thing to mention is that I think for their paper, it's more likely that the father and the son has the same occupation than the son and father-in-law have the same occupation. So these kind of bias could actually explain most of the pattern that we see in the data that they explain. Okay, so 1 minute, so let me just, so first, full disclosure, I know all this stuff because my wife is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Yale and she works in human genetics. So she regularly publishes in Nature Genetics. Just very quickly, it's something called complex traits. Those are traits that are maybe fully determined genetically or to a large extent, but they are determined by many genes and many SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. That means even if you were to explain for a given individual 100% of that trait with genes, these are made by many, many genes. And when you try to correlate the father and the son of the heritability, then the heritability will be 0. Okay. So the best studies for this are these 2 papers. One of them is 2018. The other one is just forthcoming. And they're using 23andMe, similar to Ancestry DNA, but they actually have a lot of observables and a lot of and the full genome. Those studies are essentially explaining with 3 million people about 10 or maybe 15% of educational attainment based on your genes. Okay. And they acknowledge that this is an upper bound because many of those correlations are not causal. Okay? Now, look at the first study. They also talk about how they found thousands of those SNPs. Okay, just go. And even when you look at just 10 of those SNPs that could explain most of the variation, the heritability is 0.3. And that's because you have so many genes that could determine the outcome that even when you can explain a lot, which you cannot, doesn't pass to the next generation genetically. So I think that the paper is great, the data is great, and the numbers subject to this bias that I mentioned will actually be understood to see that assortative mating and the mobility, the interpretation of this is genetics, I think is contrary to all the evidence we have today based on the hard science. Thank you. Sorry.
Fascinating. We have a question in the chat.
So one of the conclusions is that women's attributes mattered as much as men's for child outcomes. And on the slide, it said, except for wealth, but you didn't talk about that exception. And I'm wondering if you could say something about that.
Greg or Neil?
It's very clear from other data we have that men typically inherited more than women. And so that's why the wealth coming down the paternal line will be greater in scale than that coming from the maternal line. And so that's very clearly a social factor that goes into that. Just want to respond to the comment, though. There's nothing in this paper about genetics, right? And so, the paper is just about the mechanisms of transmission.
Do we have a question from the audience? We do have a minute or so. Greg was very generous with his time. He didn't take up all of his time. Please, question, anybody?
I have 2 minutes left. My question.
Please introduce yourself.
Greg Nemish, Miami University. So I was wondering, you said there was only sorting between the bride and the groom. I was wondering if there's an independent effect of the bride's father on resources or anything directly to the groom in terms of job opportunities, how that might mess up if at all, mess up the correlation.
It is hard to demonstrate that conclusively that the correlation is purely between the bride and the groom and that the choices being made there. I mean, social influences could be, well, maybe the groom worked with the bride's father, and so that's how they got to meet the other party. But as I say, we can do these tests of the case where the bride's father is not around, so he's died already. Any assets have been distributed from him. Any help has been distributed already. And so in those cases, we see a very kind of similar correlation. In the data also has lots of information about the age of the bride and the groom. So we could also then look at older marriages, ones where much less likelihood of parental not interference, but help. And so as I think we have to try and do a little more to demonstrate this independence, because it's a crucial element in terms of the derivation in the paper.
Any more questions? Co-author Neil, are you happy with what Greg said? Do you want to say something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to the comments, and the lion's share of the comments revolved around this issue of how we're assigning scores to occupations. So thanks for those comments. And it's I think we can play around with that in the way you suggest, and I see what you're saying. Empirically, for England, it's not the case that you have any one occupation that's like taking up like 40% of the population, like farming or something like that in the 19th century US. The occupations are quite diverse. So, I see what you're saying. We're assigning one score for an occupation, and maybe we could do some simulated assignment where you randomly draw from the distribution and the variance. That can be implemented. I can guarantee that will not change the picture here, but just empirically by the way the diversity of occupations, just knowing how the data is structured in reality. So yeah, it's potentially like an issue, but I don't think in reality it actually is causing any bias for us. Like I mentioned, we have another paper with Matt here that looks extensively at how to score occupations. But the idea of assigning with a simulated draw is a nice idea. We can look closer at that. But yeah, we don't think it's causing any bias here. Thanks.
We're running out of time. Real quick, hurry up, right there.
Yeah. So yes, the point is that you have an occupation that most people have is that in your data, the last fraction of the data is where father and son have the same occupation, whatever that occupation might be.
Okay, clearly, Jose, you need to chat with the two authors. Okay, over drinks or something. Okay, all right, we move on to the next paper. And this is Jennifer Withrow from the U.S. Census Bureau. I'm going to let her, get your slide over there. Share. Wait, they're not displaying. Oh, okay. Yes. Let me just. Oh, we're good. Okay. Wait. You need to share them. Yeah. No, go back to Zoom. Yeah, you can do it from here. Yeah. Great.
So yeah, everyone can hear me and see my slides okay? All right, so it's great to be here. I want to begin this presentation by sharing an excerpt from a letter received by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1915. They had reached out to women on farms just to ask them what life was like for them on the farm. So one woman from Minnesota wrote in, "I have always lived on a farm except for the first 5 years of my marriage. I think I might almost as soon as been in jail because the work is so hard and never done." So this paper was inspired in large part by accounts like these received by the USDA during the early 20th century, as they were very concerned about how women were doing on the farms, their exodus from farming, and the future of the farm family. So when the farm crisis of the 1920s and 1930s arrived, defined by steep drops in farm commodity prices, rising foreclosure rates, and disrupted farm tenure mobility, meaning the ability for a farm worker to rise from farm wage worker to tenant to owner, it had the potential to further disrupt family farming. The farming sector in the United States was and is rooted in traditional gender roles and has a long history of racial discrimination. So it is in that context that this paper is asking, how was farm family formation affected by an economic crisis? So specifically, this paper asks, to what extent did the farm crisis affect farm tenure mobility, and as a result, women's marriage rates, fertility, and off-farm labor force participation? I use geographic variation and exposure to the farm crisis with the shift share instrument based on global crop prices weighted by the share of each county's farmland devoted to certain crops. I analyzed the South and Midwest separately by race, recognizing that there are both regional and racial differences in farm tenure mobility during this time and still. And what I find is that the decline in farm commodity prices created by the farm crisis led to declines in white Southern farm tenure mobility, and that Southern white women delayed marriage as a result. Southern Black farmers who already had limited tenure mobility and Midwestern white farmers who were more likely to inherit land, capital from family were insulated from the direct detrimental effects of the crisis. So as I mentioned, I look at two different regions here, the Midwest and the South. So there are important differences between them in terms of farm family tenure mobility. So for example, Midwestern farmers were overwhelmingly white and were more likely to be working family-owned land. So inheritance of land, farm equipment, or other capital was a common method for advancing up the farm tenure ladder. In contrast, Southern farming, and especially Southern tenant farming, was defined by a system of sharecropping where tenants paid rent as a share of their crop. And in the South, Black tenant farmers were mostly sharecroppers. Sharecropping was often exploitative of Black farmers. White landowners tried very hard to keep them on land, made it difficult for them to rise up the farm tenure ladder through legal and also violent means. Additionally, Black farmers already lacked generational wealth as a result of slavery. So it was very difficult for them to acquire land on their own because white landowners refused to sell to Black families. So what was the farm crisis? Well, first of all, it was preceded by a farming boom during World War I. So while European farming was destroyed, U.S. farmers increased production as a response. They took out farm debt to finance their expansion. However, there was the first of two dramatic drops in farm commodity prices after European farming recovered rather quickly after World War I, and that led to a high instance of farm foreclosure and farm distress. There was another steep drop in farm commodity prices during the early 1930s, especially in cotton and fueled in large part by the Great Depression. So finally, this paper is informed by a much larger literature on adverse labor market conditions for men and how, when there are adverse labor market conditions for men, men's marriageability falls as the gains from marriage fall. So women will opt to delay marriage. Historically, marriage rates in farming communities were higher and the average age at first marriage lower. Marriage was often the necessary precursor to farm ownership. Men rarely set out on their own to own a farm without the aid of a farm wife. And for women, it was very unusual for them to have access to earning a livelihood, say, on a farm without the farm family. In the South, just in 1920, only 3% of white women and 13% of Black women were listed as independent farm wage workers in the census. And in the South in 1920, only 3 to 4% of farm owners were women at all, most of them white and most of them inheriting that land after their spouse had passed away. So this really highlights the importance of the interaction of the labor, marriage, and land markets in kind of family formation on the farm during this time. Acquisition of land was required for farm families and thus women's socioeconomic mobility. So when the farm crisis really disrupted that pattern and led to declines in tenure mobility or the ability to even enter the tenure ladder at all, that could have in turn and does in turn reduce men's marriageability and may have women delaying marriage as a result. So data for this project come from the U.S. Census of Agriculture, which are available every 5 to 10 years. And they have information on things like the size of farms in a county, the farm debt, or the crop mix, the share of land devoted to certain crops. I also use the U.S. full and complete count census data. So using the full count census data, I create 3 of my major outcomes of interest, which is the decadal change at the county level of women's marriage rates, fertility, and off-farm labor force participation. I also use it to create often race-specific controls like population density, male-to-female ratios, and school attendance rates. And then using the complete count census data, meaning full names are included, I create a county-level measure of tenure mobility among men, using that complete count data to link men over time. So what does it mean to link men over time? Well, basically, I'm just following them from one census year to the next. And I do this using the ABE method created by Abramitsky, Stone, and Erickson. And I think what that means is I'm linking using names, ages, and places of birth. At the time I did this, I did do the linking using the codes they provide, but now those links are also available from the Census Linking Project. So what I'm doing here is I'm linking a man from either 1910 to 1920, 1920 to 1930, or 1930 to 1940, and I'm measuring the change in the share of men who are either able to move up or down or off the tenure ladder over the course of the decade in a county. So whether that's moving from wage worker to tenant, tenant to owner, owner to non-farm, owner to tenant, I'm looking at all those different categories. So the final thing I want to do is I want to create a measure of crisis exposure at the county level. So the way I do this is I multiply the share of each county's farmland acreage devoted to certain agricultural commodities in 1920. So I look at wheat, corn, which I use as a proxy for livestock since it was the main source of feed, cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. And I multiply that by the change in the domestic prices received by farmers for each commodity over each decade, so 1920 to 1930 and 1930 to 1940. So these two maps show the variation in crisis exposure in each decade. So here, the darker reds are indicating a county was more exposed in that decade to the crisis. So these shocks to farm commodity prices were primarily driven by international events. So they are maybe already plausibly exogenous to local developments, but there is a concern that there is something going on more locally that might be affecting both farm commodity prices and the outcomes that I'm interested in. So for example, we might see declines in domestic farm commodity prices as a result of increased productivity through things like mechanization, which reduce the reliance on family farm labor or increase the capital requirements for tenure mobility, which in turn could reduce tenure mobility or delay marriage. So to help with that, I instrument kind of that domestic price measure with a global price index for these commodities created by Blattman, Huang, and Williamson. And what is a shift share instrument? And as with any instrument, I'm concerned, is it relevant and does it satisfy the exclusion restriction? So in this case, my first stage results are very strong. And that's pretty unsurprising given that domestic prices closely track global prices, especially for cotton, wheat, and tobacco during this time. And that makes actually up the bulk of the variation in my measure in the South. And though I can't directly test the exclusion restriction, I do a falsification test, and I find no effect of this measure of farm prices using global prices on 1910 to 1920, so pre-crisis changes in my outcomes. Okay, so this is my estimating equation. What I do is I stack 10-year equivalent first differences. Here, delta y is the decadal change in the outcome of interest over time intervals 1920 to 1930 and 1930 to 1940. Delta FC is that standardized crisis exposure measure instrumented by the global prices. X prime is a vector of period controls, and I also include state fixed effects, a dummy for the second period, and the 1920 total share crisis exposure in a county. So the first thing that I find is that there is significant bottlenecking at the tenancy level among Southern white farmers. So this is a coefficient plot that shows that a 1 standard deviation increase in crisis exposure led to the share of white Southern farmers rising from wage worker to tenant to increase by about 7 percentage points. The share that were able to rise from tenant to owner decreased by about 5.4 percentage points, and the share that fell down the tenure ladder from owner to tenant increased by about 3.4 percentage points. When I look at Southern Black farmers, I see no similar significant relationship between crisis exposure and tenure mobility. And the same goes for Midwestern white farmers. So what was it about white Southern tenure mobility that was different than Black Southern or white Midwestern tenure mobility? So the first thing I want to highlight is that Black farmers already had limited access to tenure mobility to begin with. If you were a Black tenant farmer, which is what I can see in the census in 1920 or 1930, you were likely a sharecropper. You were already having a hard time getting up to the ownership level. Additionally, this change in farm crisis exposure is measuring specifically changes in crop prices. So decreased crop prices actually make landowners want to hire sharecroppers. They can pay a sharecropper the cheaper crop commodity rather than paying them the wage. So that also helps for mobility to remain strong between the wage to tenant category. Among Midwestern farmers, there's a lot of historical evidence that they were working family land, inheriting farm equipment from family members, and that helps to keep their mobility on the ladder pretty constant. I next look at Southern white ever married rates, and I find that Southern white women's ever married rates were the most affected by the crisis. which is really highlighting this connection between decreased tenure mobility and white women choosing to delay marriage. So again, we can see that among the youngest age groups, 15 to 29, that women are delaying marriage anywhere from about 0.5 to 2 percentage points. When we look at Southern Black women, we do see some evidence of delayed marriage as well, especially in the 20 to 24 age group and the 30 to 34 age group. And then looking at Midwestern white women, we see some modest delay of marriage in the 20 to 24 age group. So what's happening here is, yes, I think, that decline in tenure mobility is a good mechanism, especially for explaining white Southern women's delay of marriage. But clearly there's something else about the farm crisis that might also be incentivizing women to delay marriage. So the two things I want to focus on is during this time, it was very difficult to enter the farming tenure ladder at all. It was much more difficult. And in a 1939 survey of rural youth that was done by the government at the time, they asked them, why aren't you getting married? What are your opinions about marriage? And the two main answers were there's just no income or there's just no opportunity. Secondly, we see an increase sort of combined households during this period where more adult women were staying home and not getting married in order to help both in field and care work. And this is especially true on subsistence farms. So I do look at some other results here, particularly whether these women who were on farm were more likely to take off-farm work, if they were more affected by the crisis. So what I find is those women who stayed on farm were not significantly more likely to take off-farm work. And what I think is going on here and what I look at in other work is instead of staying on farm and trying to find work in their rural area, these women are migrating off farm to urban areas where there is much more opportunity for them to find kind of gender appropriate work. The last thing that I find is that Black women in higher crisis exposure areas had fewer children, specifically fewer young children. So I'm looking at the share, the number of children under 5 per ever married woman in a county. And what I think this is reflecting is the challenges of raising additional young children on farms that had the fewest reserve resources and greatest use of children's labor. So this is particularly true for sharecropping farms. When you have young children that are under 5, they can help you in the fields. You're often taking your oldest daughters out of the fields, or you're taking mothers out of the fields to help raise them inside the home. So when farm earnings were low, this could be a particular challenge for a family. Okay, so in conclusion, what I show is that the farm crisis had significant effects on white Southern tenure mobility, but not others. This is due in part to Black farmers' mobility already being limited, and also the role of family inheritance that may have helped preserve white mobility up the ladder in the Midwest. I show that white Southern women delayed marriage in response in what seems to like white men's delayed tenure mobility. But also there is some delay of marriage among both Black and Midwestern white women as well, likely reflecting this kind of no opportunity for marriage in farming communities, and also this importance of the combined household during economic crisis. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. We have Carl Kitchens to comment on this. And you have slides. Okay.
Right, great. I'm Carl Kitchens. So I guess full disclosure, I'm also currently working on a paper about the agricultural boom and bust and fertility. So getting assigned this paper as a discussant was great because it's sort of right up my alley right now. So just sort of summarize the paper and really the model laid out. The way the paper describes the chain of events is you've got this post-World War I farm collapse. So during World War I, you have the big boom, a lot of debt is taken out, then prices drop, people can't fulfill those debts. You have a lot of farm bankruptcies, you have a lot of banks. So if you think about Matt Jonesky and Dave Wheelock's work, a lot of banks going out of business. And this is going to push potential high-quality mates down the labor ladder on farms. So as this quality degrades, these potential matches are less attractive. So women may just choose to wait to find a better match. This postpones the marriage, and as marriage is postponed, it's going to affect fertility. So this is the chain of events, and then the way that we want to think about it. Some of my comments are going to sort of come back to this chain of events because ultimately, I mean, I have the same problem in my own work. It's reduced form, so sort of nailing the mechanism and being sort of absolutely sure that this is the mechanism is the challenge here. All right, so the way that she's going to measure the collapse is very similar to, I'm going to show you the data from what we're doing in our paper as a comparison. One of the questions that I have that's going to come up is you focus on these 6 crops. There are a lot more crops out there. I've gotten the same comment. Paul Rohde is in the audience. He's going to hopefully ask about livestock. No, I'm putting Paul on the spot. I shouldn't do that. No, all right. Okay. Thank you, Paul. But so a couple of questions come up in terms of why only look at the subset of the nation when the data is there for the rest of the country. Okay, so this is sort of more crops, more data, and sort of what our stuff looks like. But it's largely the same picture. It's just, it's not clear to me why it's only these 6 crops. And it wasn't clear to me reading the paper if you're choosing these 6 crops in part because of the IV strategy and what's available for the global prices. And I may have just missed that in the paper. So that could be part of it. But there's a lot more variation out there. And sort of as my co-author, Luke Rogers, and I have gone through our paper, sometimes the add-in hay and forage crops really affects the variation in what this index looks like, because there are certain parts. It may be less of an issue in your paper because you don't have the West, but for states like Pennsylvania and the West, there's a lot of livestock growing going on, and if you sort of miss that, it creates this measurement error. That can be problematic. All right. So, ultimately, the reason why people are using this index is we don't have income data for the time. So the ideal experiment or data would just be look at these changes in the labor ladder and income or marriage rates and income. We don't have that. That's one of the reasons to use this ag index. And it's a really good, if you have enough crops, it's a really, really good measure of agricultural crop revenue, or the revenue side. So you can go into, I think, the 1930 ag census, where they have this variable that's the value of crops bought, sold, and traded, and construct this index and run regressions. And you can get really, really high R-squareds if you and explaining that variation of the crop revenue by adding crops. So my suspicion is that you would be explaining a little bit less of the variation just using those 6 crops. Again, this can be important. So one of the other things that also comes up to me is one of the nice things about the index is that the idea with the national prices is that the local farmer shouldn't be impacting this local the price, right? So you're worried that, I'm a big farmer, I've got monopoly power in local markets, I can influence the price. The national price should get around that. So this sort of, when you go to the global prices, this sort of raises the question, why instrument in this case, given that you already have the national prices?
How? I interrupted. The slides are not moving online. Is there a way you can maybe reshare them? Stop sharing and reshare maybe?
Maybe. That's okay.
You have to make a full screen presentation mode and then share. This problem happened yesterday.
How about we just share the screen? All right, now. All right. Okay, so yes, we can all see this?
No, it's in here.
Can you see it on Zoom?
It's the Zoom.
All right. Okay, so there's this index, and we've got national prices that hopefully resolve some of the sort of endogenous local pricing. So then this sort of asks the question of, well, what's the potential endogeneity that's left? So one issue could be that, you're worried about farmers endogenously responding to prices and changing their planting, but that's fixed by using these 1920 crop shares. So you're sort of limiting that. So that to me leaves omitted variables, bias, or measurement error are the things you're worried about. And in the paper, you mentioned things like, well, it's increased productivity because of mechanization. I'm a little bit less concerned about that because we'll come to specification in a second, but you have in all of these different fixed effects. And since you have things in first differences, a lot of the fixed effects that you have in there are going to wash out that type of concern that you are raising. So I actually think the OLS is better than you think, ex ante. And sort of the point I want to raise about the IV is that given the types of concerns that you have, I'm not sure that moving to the global price actually solves the problem you think about, that you think might exist in terms of the mechanization, because a lot of things have to be true about the way the local farmer can impact the national price, but not the global price. And for something like cotton, where the U.S. is something like 30% of exports, I would think those same concerns exist. Problem's not unique to you. It's just think about that a little bit. So sort of back to the mechanisms and what's actually done in the paper. So the chain of events was crop prices drop, marriageable men fall down the labor ladder. They're less sort of appealing. Marriage is delayed. What's actually done in the paper? Well, it's reduced form paper. So you're looking at these things sort of in separate regressions, and that makes the mechanism a little bit harder, right? There are a lot of alternate stories. So, for example, in my own work, some of the stories people have asked me about is, well, what about food prices? Food prices are changing because of the ag boom and ag bust. That affects the price of feeding a family. I don't think that's the case, but there are alternate mechanisms. In my work, the story is an opportunity cost story because female wages are rising in response. So there's not a lot of great wage evidence out there, but in Pennsylvania, there's this gender-specific farm wage data that you can show during the boom period. Wages are tracking pretty closely with the agricultural price index. So it could be a wage story, it could be a marriageable men story, and it's tough to sort of isolate these different stories. And so I want to push you a little bit to think about how to rule out some of the alternate mechanisms to really think about, is it actually movement up and down the labor line, right? And this is always the tough part of these types of papers, is there are a ton of different mechanisms. And, just have to be really clear that we think and we're sure that this is the one, right? A couple of things. So I have a long list of things that I was thinking about and things I'd like to see. So one thing that is tough in this world is there's a lot of exit from farming during this period. So in some respects, it's difficult to know if exiting is movement up or down the labor ladder, right? So if people are endogenously choosing, so it must be welfare enhancing for them to do so. And then that raises some questions about sort of losing people for differential matches and that sort of stuff. Some other things that come up, I'm always really worried once we start talking about agriculture and the 1930s. There's a lot of policy specifically being developed to deal with the fact that the farm sector is in the tank. Briggs Depew, Paul Rohde, and Price Fishback have some nice paper looking at how the AAA grants affect movement on the labor ladder and push black farmers off, right? Push black farmers off because the owner operators or the owners are sort of taking the most marginal land out of production. So I think, something that's really easy is cut off the data at 1930 and don't deal with it. Some other things that I think just might help the paper is, since you have these equations and first differences, just start from before you take the difference, start to really make it clear what fixed effects are actually in there, because you have a state fixed effect, but since you have things in first differences, it's really like a state time trend. And I think all of those things will just help clear up what variations actually left and what sort of endogeneity problems we should be worried about. And then there are some other things that are just tough to deal with in this period. What sort of exposure, we just aren't exposed in 1910, 20, 30, and 40. There's sort of, these things are long-lasting events, and sort of think about ways to actually exploit the fact that exposure is different for different cohorts. But this is right up my alley. I'm facing a lot of the same problems, and I'll be interested to see where this goes. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. All right, do we have a question from the audience? Please come up.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I have a question just about, when you talk about people moving down from owner to tenant, in aggregate, somebody's still owning these properties, right? And so is there an aggregate? Is it washed out? Is there a transfer to somebody? Who's the capitalist class? Who's owning these properties after people are moving down?
Thank you. In general, I think it's mostly the consolidation of farms. So larger landowners are just kind of consolidating into larger farms. So you have this, farms are getting larger and you have fewer people that are actually owning.
Hi, yeah, Matt Curtis. I have 2 questions. The first is you're blocking on race in the matching.
Yes.
Is there any concern with people switching race? Because there are papers that observe that. Second, like they're passing as a different race intentionally in some circumstances. The second question is, I think what you're doing is pooling the price shocks to all the crops together. But if one of the mechanisms is child labor, different crops have different suitabilities for child labor, so it might be interesting to break it down by crop. Okay.
Yeah, so I do match based on race, and I recognize that that's a problem as individuals can change their race over time. I think what I might do is do a link also not blocking on race and see if that really affects anything. That's a great point. And yeah, the child labor point is well taken. And, I think wheat and especially cotton is going to have that be a greater effect, which is why I think I see that as an effect for black farmers who are most likely to be sharecroppers and not for my Midwestern white or Southern white farmers. But that would be something to look at. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? We have like 30 seconds more. Anything in the chat? No? All right. We move on. Okay. Matthew Curtis, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just trying to get the slides up first. Oh. Now I need to go back to Zoom.
Go back. Here. Oh, okay. Yeah, here.
Sorry. Oh, there we are. Thank you.
Okay. Let me. I'll interrupt you for the slide.
All right. Thank you for having me here. So, not intentionally, but parts of my paper are very similar to Greg and Neil's. So my paper asks the question, when did spouses start matching strongly on human capital? And this is motivated by the fact that this is an issue of contemporary concern as female labor force participation in education has increased. Theory predicts that assortment is going to get tighter matching, and this will have consequences for inequality. The reason why we think this might happen is that who you marry, if the woman is working and the man is working, is going to increase your household income. So we expect more assortment, but actually the contemporary evidence is rather mixed. We don't find strong evidence of one. So I think it's really helpful to look at marriages before the mid-20th century to give us a long-run context. So I used 2 million marriages from Quebec 1800 to 1969, and I showed that assortment had always been high. Matches were on the individual human capital of women as well as men, and this matters for child outcomes. So I think Quebec is a good setting because especially in the beginning of this time period, it's relatively conservative on gender roles. For example, women can't vote in local elections in 1940. It has relatively low human capital at the beginning of the period. And it has a rather extreme version of the European marriage pattern. There's very large families. So women are very restricted in their economic role, especially in terms of formal employment for wages. So we expect assortment to only start mattering strongly when women have a formal employment in the market and earning an income. We'd expect to not find it in Quebec during this period. Otherwise, it's very similar to its North American neighbors. So it's an interesting test case. It also has really good data. So as opposed to, say, a linked census sample, the data I'm going to use has daughter-father links because women keep their family names when they get married in Quebec. It has complete family structures.
The Zoom audience can't see you.
It has complete family structures. So I observe all the siblings who share a family, even if they're not living together, like in a census. And finally, there's a lot of remarriage in Quebec. If you lose a spouse, you get remarried very quickly, and I'm going to use that later in my empirical strategy. So the source is called the IMPQ. It's the combination of two previous data sets. There's millions of records of births, deaths, marriages. In this paper, I'm using marriages. It's nearly the complete population. It's missing some Protestants because it uses church records. I'm going to focus on the Catholics. And the links are very high quality because women keep their family name when they get married. The difficulty with the data set is measuring female human capital directly. I can directly measure signatures, which are a good measure of literacy, at least basic literacy, but it is a 0-1 variable. And there's a lot of change over time in this period. So the other measure I use sometimes is the occupational status of the father. In the results I'll show you today, I'm using the earnings of that occupation in the 1901 Canadian Census. It's pretty robust to other measures of occupational status, though. So the first thing I'm going to show you is assortments always being high. This is using the same method as Greg and Neil. To recap for people who might not have seen it, the idea here is 3 strong assumptions. The wife is directly matching to the husband at rate gamma. The husband's not matching with the father-in-law. Second, both the husband and the wife inherit their human capital at rate beta. That's the same for both men and women. And third, I'm going to take the ratio of beta times gamma, here the correlation between the husband and the father-in-law, divide by the correlation between the father and the husband. That's hopefully going to give me gamma, the rate of marital assortment. I'm going to assume here that the measurement error is the same in this correlation as it is in this correlation. So hopefully this is robust to measurement error. Here are the raw ingredients. The father-in-law, son-in-law correlation is in blue. The father-son correlation is in red. I'm going to take the blue line, divide it by the red line, and give me a measure of assortment over time. And here's what it looks like. Similar to Greg and Neil, I find that it is very high. It is very stable over time. There is perhaps some time trends, but overall it's high and fairly stable. And of course, this has the same potential criticisms that we heard in Greg and Neil's paper. And I really like the idea of drawing from the distribution of occupations in the case where fathers and sons have the same occupation. And I think that actually might be more of a concern in Quebec than in England, just because there's fewer occupations I observe and there are lots of farmers. So that point is very well taken. And this is robust to various things. One thing that I think is interesting is you can use IV when I see multiple occupations for the same person. This will deal with the assumption that the measurement error is the same in both of the ratios. I find a very similar result. It wouldn't deal with a non-standard measurement error though, so I'm going to think about that more. The next part of my paper is I'm going to show you that these matches really are on individual human capital, and they're taking into account the human capital of the woman. So you might think that perhaps marriages are an alliance between families, and you're really marrying into a family. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use parental fixed effects. The idea is I'm going to find a family where one sister cannot sign her name, one sister can sign her name, and then I'm going to see if their husbands look different. So here's the regression. If a woman can sign her name compared to her sister who cannot sign her name, her husband is 30 percentage points more likely to sign his name than the other husband of the sister. And I can do the same thing with men. If a man can sign his name compared to his brother who can't, his wife is 28 percentage points more likely to sign her name. So there is a caveat here. While I do have 2 million marriages, the samples where there's a family where one sibling is literate, one is illiterate, is much smaller than the rest of the sample. In the full paper, I talk a lot about this, but the variation does seem to be real. There really are these families where one sibling is literate, one is illiterate, and it's not always, say, the older sibling who's illiterate because of time trends and schooling. There does seem to be something going on. I think parents might be investing more resources into the more promising children to hopefully match them better in marriage. All right, now I'm going to talk about why this matters. So why do you care if you're marrying a literate woman? And the consequence is that it really does matter for your child outcomes. So here I have two empirical strategies. The first one is I'm using remarriage, and I'm going to have a fixed effect for one of the parents. So the idea here is perhaps a husband has remarried and his first wife is illiterate, the second wife is literate. Do the children of the second wife have better outcomes than the children of the first wife? And here I'm not going to always look at the first wife being literate, the second one illiterate. I look at it the other way around too. So what does this look like? So if, so comparing two daughters of the same father, one has a mother who can sign her name, one has a mother who cannot sign her name. If your mother can sign your name, her name, you are 2 percentage points more likely to sign your name. This is very, very small, but it is significant. And we'd actually expect this to be very, very small because we know that there is a high degree of assortment. So even if one of the wives can sign her name, the second one can't, they're otherwise very similar, is my interpretation. So I can do this for both mothers and fathers. And the effect is almost identical for mothers and fathers here. So the human capital of a father has a very, very similar effect to the human capital of a mother. Here, though, I'm running into very small numbers of identifying observations, which could be a problem. I do the same thing for sons. Now my slides aren't moving. And sons have a very similar pattern here. If you remember in my measurement of assortment too, I assume that human capital is inherited the same for both sons and daughters. And the evidence here suggests that it's at least very similar for sons and daughters, 0.2 and 0.3, 0.02 and 0.03. And other evidence in the paper has similar results, that there does seem to be a symmetry, at least in Quebec, in the way you inherit human capital from your parents. That could be Quebec specific, though. The second empirical strategy deals with the fact that there's very few identifying observations here. There aren't that many cases where you remarry and your second spouse has a different literacy status. So here, the approach is to directly compare two children who share one parent. They may or may not share the second parent, but I know that they share at least one parent. So the idea here is I have two women. There are either sisters or half-sisters. And they share a father in column 1. So the association between their literacy, if they share a father, is 0.36. In addition to sharing a father, if they also share a mother, it adds another 0.06 on top of that 0.36. So in other words, the association between literacy is 0.36 if you're half sisters, it's 0.42 if you're full sisters. So knowing that you share a mother gives me additional information about how similar children are. Not particularly surprising, but this is controlling for the father. So the mother does do something to the children independent of the father. I can do the same thing for two women who share a mother and may or may not share a father. It has a very similar effect. Again, I'm finding symmetry in the effects of parents. Same thing for brothers. Here, it's not quite as symmetrical, but the effect of sharing a parent, the effects of sharing both parents is stronger than the effects of only sharing one parent. So what this is hopefully showing is your mother and your father both matter independently for your outcomes as a child. And I have various robustness checks and so on here. So putting it all together, I say that assortment has always been high in Quebec. And this is again a society where before the 1970s, female employment in the formal labor market is very low. Your mother is not going to be using her human capital to earn a wage income in the formal sector, at least. But your parents did match on human capital quite strongly. And this match was on individual human capital. It wasn't between families, and I used the family fixed effects to show that. And finally, it does have a consequence for inequality, not necessarily in terms of household income, but in the intergenerational channel. The human capital of your mother matters as much as the human capital of your father for outcomes during this period. And I think that really also explains why we see high assortment, even though women aren't earning an income in the formal employment after they get married. It really does matter who you marry because it matters for your children. And I think that helps explain why in modern papers, there is very mixed evidence on whether or not assortment has gone up as women entered the labor force. And the answer is because it mattered before who you married. And it mattered because mothers mattered as much as fathers for child outcomes. And I will stop a little early, I think. So thank you.
Okay, that was unexpected. We have so many speakers. All speakers today are well behaved. Laura is going to be discussing this paper, and I want to make sure. Oh, she can share. Great.
All right, great. I'm going to move to a slideshow.
Fantastic.
All right.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Thanks for allowing me to do this virtually. I'm very envious of all of you who are there in person. Coming from Canada was a bit trickier than I would like it to be. So I couldn't be there. But I'm very happy to discuss this paper. So this paper studies assortative mating in the marriage market in Quebec over a wonderfully long period of 150 years. The data, so Matthew uses the IMPQ database, which is essentially like a universe of linked vital records. So with information on marriage, births, and deaths. The key component of this database for the purposes of this paper is that women, unlike the rest of North America, women in Quebec retained family names after marriage, so that making intergenerational links involving married women is actually possible. Right? This is super important and unique. So this is really cool. Measures of socioeconomic status are also available in these records. So there's a measure of literacy, right, which is whether women can sign their marriage certificates or not. And then there are men's occupations, right? So the paper is sort of really focused on understanding the relationship between marriage and intergenerational mobility, right? Even in an environment in which mothers aren't working, right? So the fact that mothers' human capital is correlated with fathers' human capital means, essentially mothers are, when not observed, they're sort of omitted variables in these intergenerational regressions, right? So, in that sense, it really matters how related mothers and fathers' human capital is, right? If mothers impact their children, that's going to really matter for measures of intergenerational mobility. So my general comment is that I really like the paper. It's a really important, observation that marriage matters for the intergenerational persistence of socioeconomic status. There's a literature evolving on this topic, but it's relatively small and it's relatively new. I was really glad to see that there were, not one but two papers on the EHA program devoted to this question. The data set, I've been aware of this data set for some years. It's really incredible. I've never worked with it myself. I think it's like a crime that it's not used more often in our field. So I really appreciate that this paper is showcasing this really incredible data set. So despite the fact that the data set is fantastic, there are some limitations, right? So women's socioeconomic status or human capital it more or less use those interchangeably, is difficult to measure and not always observed directly. But the paper has these really cool strategies for circumventing these measurement challenges. So it was a pleasure to read. I was impressed by it, and I learned some new things. So in terms of more specific comments, so the paper does three major things. So first, it measures the degree of marital sorting, right, even without direct observations of women's human capital, and shows that this has been, more or less stable over, 150-year period. The second thing the paper does is try to establish whether spouses match on their own characteristics or their parents' characteristics. And third, the paper shows, basically, a channel, right, through which mothers matter for intergenerational mobility, like or persistence from fathers to sons, which is that mothers invest in their children's human capital, right? So he shows that there is kind of a causal effect of mothers' human capital on children's human capital. So I'll sort of comment on each of these in turn. All right, so my first comment has to do with the way SES is measured, and this is a challenge. Obviously, so the sort of observed, directly observed measure of women's SES is literacy, right? The indirectly observed measure of women's SES is the occupational status of her father. With respect to literacy, and this is a point that Matthew is pretty clear about in the paper, but being unable to sign your name on your marriage certificate goes from being like a relatively crude signal of SES to being a pretty precise signal, because over the course of the period, the literacy rate goes up a lot. So what does it mean that sorting on this measure, which goes from being sort of a crude measure to a more precise measure, stays stable over time, right? Does that mean that sorting on kind of underlying human capital is stable over time? Or not, right? What are the circumstances under which you can extrapolate in that way? Some sort of discussion of that, I think, would be helpful. So with respect to occupational status, and this is sort of the same thing that Greg and Neil did in their paper. So he's going to infer a correlation between sort of sons and wives' human capital through the difference between the correlation between fathers and sons and fathers-in-law and sons-in-law. And I think this rests on fathers-in-law not having a direct impact on their sons-in-law's occupations, which, I'm with you that fathers-in-law can't impact a son-in-law's sort of human capital as kind of accumulated in, early childhood and young adulthood. But fathers-in-law might open up career pathways for their sons-in-law. Is it really right to say that there's no kind of direct impact there? And if not, right, then how might that sort of change the way we interpret the findings? So the next thing the paper does is try to understand whether people match on their parents' traits or their own traits. And here, so Matthew does something really cool. So he uses this family fixed effects model to try to sort of disentangle, matching on own traits from matching on parental traits, right? So the identification here comes from sort of sisters or brothers with different sort of literacy levels. So, if you have one sister who's literate and the other sister who's illiterate, right, does the illiterate sister systematically marry kind of lower human capital husbands than the literate sister? Again, I thought this was really cool. I had some sort of questions, which I guess you could sort of like levy this criticism against any family effects model. But what does it mean to to be the illiterate sister in a literate family, right? Is that, like an even stronger kind of negative signal than just being an illiterate sister from an illiterate family, right? So is this like capturing kind of the like global difference between the outcomes of literate and illiterate people, or is there maybe something sort of different? I also would be curious just to hear about, so yeah, you can show that people sort on parental or sort on their own traits rather than exclusively parental traits. Like, I want to know a little bit more about how this sort of matters for the intergenerational persistence of socioeconomic status. That's an interesting question. Finally, so Matthew tries to pin down a causal effect of mothers on their children, and this, like, you can't just run a regression of son's income on father's human capital and mother's human capital and say there's a significant coefficient on mothers, therefore mothers matter independent of fathers, right? Because fathers are measured with error, right? And if mothers and fathers are correlated, you can get a significant coefficient on mothers, even if there's no sort of direct causal effect, right? So what he does is leverage half siblings, and so holding one parent constant but varying the human capital of the other parent. What is the effect there? And I mean, I don't have any criticisms. That this is super cool and smart. Okay, so that's all I've got. I really like the paper. Thanks very much.
Do we have some questions? Please come to the podium. Whatever. Well, why don't we let her come first? Or you can speak from there too. Introduce yourself, please.
I was just wondering about, I guess, kind of in particular in the context of Quebec, the public education system was segregated by religions at that basically the entirety of their time span. So basically, literacy among women is pretty much a measure of how religious they were and how entrenched in religious communities they were. So I wonder how that, I guess, affects the interpretation of your results in terms of intergenerational transmission of literacy.
So thanks for that question. So religion plays a huge role in education in Quebec in this period, for sure. Actually, the public education isn't even, there isn't a public education system until substantially into the 19th century. So a lot of the early education would be through nuns. So that I hadn't thought about if being literate makes you more religious in this period because you've been exposed to a religious school. And I think that's a fascinating question, and I'll have to think about that. In general, I think Quebec society is quite religious overall in this period. For example, you don't see secularization of society until the 1960s, which is confusingly called the Quiet Revolution, which is also a title of a paper about the kind of more general North American increase in female labor force participation rates. And I think in Quebec, that's very tied too. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's quite strict on female employment and so on, is it's tied into this very conservative society overall. But if women who are literate are more religious, that could have very interesting effects, and I'll have to think about it.
Jose.
Yeah, great paper. Also, in terms of assortative mating, in addition to running the regression, when you try to explain, say, the status of the bride as a function of the status of the groom, you may also try to add in the same regression the status of the groom's father and mother, because the matching could be done in different variables, not just one variable. So rather than testing where it's done just the bride and groom or bride and the father, could be done through both, or even through the mother. So you can try to add those to see. Matching could be more complex just for that.
Yeah, I think the matching is the results I have on the stability of the matching rate over time is very strongly tied to that assumption that matching is just between spouses. I did try to do a little bit of exploration into evidence of that. So the best evidence I have, and it's only available for the first part of the data set because I run out of death records by 1849 for now. But I compared two sisters, one who marries after her father died, one who marries before her father died, and the matching there's no difference in their husbands in terms of the status. So it doesn't seem like losing your father changes on average the status of the husband you end up with. But I do think I could go further into that, like maybe mothers matter more than fathers for matching. I'm not sure. And that would be an interesting question. And for sure, if you don't believe that matching is just between spouses, then that does mean that pretty red graph I showed you that being stable over time has a flawed assumption. So take that with a grain of salt if you don't believe that assumption. Thanks.
Any more questions?
I have some answers for
well,
the discussion.
These are people who want to go to lunch. So you have like okay. 20 seconds. Anybody on the line want to ask a question?
So just real quick, the literacy match, the assortment on literacy isn't stable over time, actually, and that's why I use this father-in-law strategy, because the literacy rate is changing so much over time, and it's also a correlation of a 0-1 variable. It gives very unclear results if you look at that over time. The other thing is the sample where one sibling is literate and the other one isn't is not going to generalize to the rest of the population, for sure. It is a rather unique population, and I don't think the coefficient is going to be the same for the general population. I think there is just more trying to show that there does seem to be an independent effect in individual human capital, not provide a estimate for the whole population. So thanks for those comments.
I think it's a wrap. What do you think? All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody online.